Hey guys, welcome to a new episode of ArtFeedback. For the second episode, we're reviewing a different kind of art piece. So this good friend of mine sent me this illustration that you can see here at the top. It's still a work in progress that he's been noodling on for a while, and he asked me for feedback mostly regarding color, mood, and atmosphere. So that's what I try to focus on when doing the paint over. There's a lot already to like in this illustration that he's been doing. I really dig, first of all, the idea of this magic crystal at the center of the piece, and then all these, creepy trees in the surrounding and these spiky rocks. I think it's pretty cool. But in terms of color and atmosphere, I think there's a bit of room to improve here and there. The first point that I want to make here is that I feel that the color are a little bit too localized, and what I mean by that is that you use this magenta for the crystal in this area and it only exists here, right? This color doesn't exist anywhere else in the image, and the same thing can be said for the other colors. We have this blue that only exists in the spit and in the back of the rocks, like atmosphere, and then the sky that kind of has this grayish, brownish color that only exists in the sky. So I think for me, this is the main aspect in terms of color that jumped at me when I was looking at this piece the first time. So one thing that I did, you can see my paint over, I tried to spread this color a little bit. So the magenta of the crystal was spread at the bottom here, from here, and then I also tried, adding some purple splashes like mushrooms or, some sort of maybe corruption that goes into the piece, just to have a way to expand the color throughout the piece, to make it more cohesive. Because if you only have localized colors, it's gonna feel a little bit off, at least in my opinion. And I did the same thing with the blue, so I got rid of the brown of the sky because I think it wasn't really helping the piece. But then I used the blue and I tried to use it in the foreground in this form of little magic butterflies, because initially I saw he had this particle, kind of bluish, doing something similar, I would say. But then I figure, if we want to make it more of a magical feel or a magical area, then we can use this little thing making glowing butterflies that recall the color of the environment. So that's how I tried to tie it all together. And I also added a little bit of blue reflection here on the crystal to, again, tie it all together. Now that we talked about how you can tie a piece together using colors in different ways, another thing that I wanted to talk about is the composition, at least a little bit, and the shapes, because in the original piece I think it's pretty clear that the focal point is at the bottom of this crystal, and that's something that I try to maintain in my paint over as well. But there are certain things that aren't really working for me, and one of those is that the crystal has, I don't really like the shape of the crystal too much. I think the design of it could be a little bit better. And also there's some contrast at the top with the sky having just a role of being a backdrop that doesn't really help pointing us down. So what I did in this instance was adding a dark element in the back that just recalls all the gnarly trees, and then I darkened the top, because when you darken the top like this, you create a gradient of sorts. Then our attention is immediately drawn at the bottom, because you can see there is very little contrast. If we check the values now, there is very little contrast, and we kind of lose the edges of this crystal. So all of our attention and contrast is brought here, where you can see in the original piece, even if we check the values overall, sure, there is a lot of contrast here where the crystal point is, but then we also have a lot of scatter contrast, and there's not a lot of grouping of values. we can see there's a bit too much range of values, for example, in these rocks here, and there's a lot of contrast in these little branches coming out of the central piece. So that's one thing that I try to get rid of. Focus completely our attention at the center by use of contrast, and then try to group the values. So we have our centerpiece, like the rocks and the trees, kind of be a small range of values that kind of feels cohesive, like a big form right there. And I think this helps the composition being a little bit more readable and clear. Now, after discussing these, I think the trees were kind of already working in the original piece, because we have all of these nice curves that are leading our eyes into the composition, and then we have these rocks that, you know, kind of frame our centerpiece, and then we have this path that leads their eye into the focal point. So these are all things that work very well already, and it's something that I try to preserve. You see, I just kept the path, just changed the shape to be a little bit more appealing to me, like a little bit more simple, if you will. And then I also try to keep, you know, the trees working as a framing tool, so they bring our eye back into the composition. So that was something that to me was already working, and I didn't change too much of it. For the sky, beside the color, like I said, it had this brownish feel by contrast. And I mean by contrast and context, because the sky itself is like a desaturated blue. It's not really brown, but when you pick a very desaturated color against, you know, is a more saturated version, it's gonna assume the complementary feel to it. So if we put a desaturated gray, like in this bottom piece, if I just grab my blue and I drop down the saturation and I put it in, it's gonna feel more brownish by comparison, and we can drop it even more. It's gonna feel warm. And this is why the sky in the top piece feels like it's warm and it's brownish. And that's not something that I felt like it was tying together with the rest of the painting. So I just tried to, you know, make it a more magic kind of creepy place. And in terms of storytelling, initially my friend didn't really explain what was going on, so I just simply created my own version of the story of this piece, and I tried to inform my choices with that. And what I mean is simply, you know, I decided that this crystal was corrupting the whole surrounding areas, so the trees were dead, like in his initial concept. But there's also magic at hand. That's why I used this very electric blue and a glowing butterfly to communicate it's a magical place. And with the purple leaking out of the crystal, that was again mostly a storytelling tool for me, not just a technical tool to expand this purple to the rest of the image. So we can see there is this substance that is leaking out of the crystal, and it's also spreading through the image. And maybe this mushroom being the same color as the liquid, it feels, you know, maybe these mushrooms are corrupted, or they are the symptom of this corruption that is spreading. So you can use these tools as a storytelling device to improve the sense of story in your pieces. Okay, now we talked about color, we talked about composition, we talked a little bit about storytelling. The other thing that I wanted to mention in this particular piece is going back to shape design. I briefly mentioned that for the crystal, but there are a lot of other things that I feel are worth discussing. And in terms of shape design, you can see, especially in the rocks, I tried to change the proportion a little bit and the shape language to make it feel more dangerous, because there's a hint of that in the original design as well. We can see these rocks are not exactly friendly, but all of them kind of have these very, you know, smooth top. They don't feel really dangerous all that much. They're kind of square as well. And the trees, they are dead and creepy, but They don't always flow very nicely against each other. There's a lot of very small shapes. So I think a lot of that can be curated a little bit better and simplified. So that's what I did when I created these shapes. With what I mentioned in the first lesson of art feedback or first feedback session, where I'm gonna try to really think about the negative space as well and the flow of the shapes and how simple they are. So you can see the paint over is not really refined, but in terms of shape, there is a lot of thought, put into these little shapes that compose our painting. And it doesn't need to be sophisticated. Quite the contrary, I feel like it can be pretty simple, but it can really do a lot for us when we think about shapes. And it's gonna be hard because there's shapes everywhere of light against dark or negative and positive space. So you really have to take a step back and think about it. It's not something that always comes very easily. But once you become more used to it, it's gonna be easier again. Seeing these shapes and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And I think this is pretty much it. There's not a whole lot of more choices that I can explain. I removed the humans from the picture, but that wasn't a choice entirely. You can keep them because they also help with the sense of scale. You can definitely see that my sense of scale changed from his picture because he has these little humans that become very, very small. But I think that if you add the person, considering the butterfly and the mushroom, they would be like pretty big here and they might become like a little bit bigger than his over there. So I think the scale changed a little bit. That's mostly a personal preference. It's not something that I would say I changed for the better, not necessarily. That's why I didn't really mention the change previously. And again, in terms of leading the eye through the image, we have these very clear path over here. We have values and shapes that push us down. We have all of these shapes that bring us to our focal point. And then we also use the foreground to kind of act as a frame and push us. And then you reach these butterflies that are flying into the image, and you can see I scatter them throughout, so it feels like they're getting smaller in space. They're also going toward this crystal for some reason. Maybe they want to die, I don't know. So all of these elements combined together give us the final look of our paint over. And I hope this was helpful to you guys. Again, if you have any question regarding this, feel free to ask them in the comments. And if you want to get a paint over yourself, there is an email in the description of the video where you can send your work to get a paint over. And thank you guys for watching. And with that, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.